Welcome back to the Strong Men podcast. I'm your host, Chris Stone, and today I'm delighted to have Peter Olusoga join me. Pete, how are you? We were chatting beforehand. You've had a couple of nice days off over the bank holiday. How are you feeling today?
Yeah, no, I'm good. Like I say, bank holiday Monday and then extra day off today on the Tuesday. The sun was out a minute ago. So yeah, doing well, thank you.
Nice. I'm feeling a bit jealous. I didn't have any days off either today or yesterday. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. I just wanted to start off by giving you an opportunity just to introduce yourself. So can you kind of let the listeners know who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, my name is Dr Peter Olusoga. I am a psychologist and a senior lecturer in psychology up at Sheffield Hallam University. My research is really in performance sport and high performance sport. I started off exploring stress and coping in high performance sports coaches, and then sort of moved more into looking at burnout and wellbeing. So still within these different high performance environments, mainly in sports coaching, but kind of more broadly speaking, exploring these ideas around well-being, what well-being is, what is sustainable well-being, how do we continue to be well when we're in these different environments where the expectations are really high, performance expectations are really high. So that's kind of my area of research, broadly speaking.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thanks very much. We'll get into a little bit more around sort of psychology in a second, but I was wondering, do you have a sort of what's your own sort of story and background, if you're happy to share some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So my background, I grew up in the northeast of England in the 80s and 90s. It was an interesting place to grow up. And I was always quite sporty. So I played basketball as a kid and did some coaching as well. And I was always sort of interested in like people. All right, I wasn't one of life's great joiner-inners, apart from when it came to sport. So I was very much kind of a people watcher. I was very interested in human behaviour and kind of why people behave the way they do. Why did different people behave differently in different circumstances and different situations? So when I was thinking about, like, do I want to go to university, and if I do, what do I want to study? Like, psychology cropped up. I thought, okay, well, this is interesting. Like, the study of human behavior, right? The study of mental processes, like that sounds awesome. So I went to Sheffield University to do my undergraduate degree in psychology. Graduated in 2001. And then, like I think a lot of graduates, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with my life. Didn't really have any kind of clear ideas of what I wanted to do. So I ended up just getting an office job for a little while. It was supposed to be like 6 months. Ended up staying there for like 2 years. And then had this sudden realization of like, what am I actually doing here? What am I doing with my life? So I quit my job, did some basketball coaching for a while, and then discovered this thing called sports psychology. I was like, I've never heard of this before. This sounds perfect, right? So I did my master's in sports psychology, and then I was just fortunate enough to be coming to the end of the master's as a couple of PhD bursaries came around. And then my supervisor said, do you fancy going for this? Do you fancy doing a PhD? I was like, well, I haven't got anything better to do, so yeah, why not? So then ended up staying on at Sheffield Hallam to do a PhD, and here I am now, kind of in this sort of area of well-being and burnout and stress in these different high-performance environments. So kind of a weird sort of twisted journey to where I've ended up. A lot of luck, I think, a lot of circumstance, but I think I'm probably in the right place.
Yeah, that sounds. It's a really interesting story to hear how that all sort of panned out. It's funny because when I kind of reflect on my own story, I do have an interest definitely in sort of human behaviours, but that was never. That hadn't been there for me initially. It's been something that's grown over time for me. Whereas for you, it sounds like that was something that was instilled, not instilled, but sort of naturally there, perhaps from a young age.
Yeah, I think so, and I think, like I say, I was never one of life's great joiner-inners, and still probably I'm not, I think. much prefer observing to actually joining. So yeah, it was just kind of a natural thing to just be curious about people and kind of what drives them and the decisions that people make and different things that can affect some of those decisions. And yeah, so it was always kind of like a natural interest, I think.
And I would imagine as well from the sort of sporting context, it kind of brings even more. There's even more for you to explore. Sort of the sort of pressure chamber that, you know, performance sport can often be. It can cause people to behave and act in interesting ways, I assume.
Yeah, it's like it's not a normal situation to be in, especially kind of at those real high levels, where like all of that pressure, all of that sort of like intense focus on the specific thing that you're trying to do. Like that's not a normal situation to be in. So like, yeah, people's behaviors and actions and thoughts are perhaps very different to what they might normally be.
I'm a huge football fan, and I support Heart of Midlothian, who have had a terrible season this season. And do you know what? It always really interests me. Like on paper, you look at the squad, and probably player for player, they're up there with like maybe the top 3 or 4 teams in the league, and but when you look at it on the pitch, it's just the team is not performing, and obviously there's a number of factors that play into that. But I'm in no doubt psychology is just a massive component that influences like a team's form and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you get to the sort of, again, that level of high performance sport, generally speaking, like everyone's good, everyone's talented, everybody wants to win, right? So the thing that separates the sort of real high performers is kind of what's going on in between your ears, like because there isn't anything left. Everybody's good, everybody's really talented. So it's, you know, how do you handle pressure? How do you work as a team? How do you communicate? Like it's all of those things, all of those sorts of mental processes are the things that can often make the difference.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I sometimes feel sorry for football managers because I feel like they take a lot of the flack when actually, you know, there's so much they can do, but there's other elements that are out with their control. Anyway, that's a totally different, I could go down a different road with that. I will not, though. I'll stop myself before I go and rant about how terrible Hearts have been this season. But yeah, so you've talked a bit about what sort of first drew you to psychology. What is it that keeps you passionate about it today?
I think honestly it's the same sorts of things. It's the same sort of genuine interest in people and the way that people work and the way that people think. Like I say, I started off exploring stress and anxiety and how people cope with stress and anxiety, and you know, people are not that great at coping with stress and anxiety. But as I've studied it more and as I've kind of gotten more into my own line of research, it's much more shifted towards this idea of well-being and what well-being actually means. Like, what is it? Is it something that we can actually tangibly grab a hold of? And how might we do that? So how can people be well and thrive and flourish, which are all technically very slightly different things I don't really understand. But, you know, how can we do that in the environments that we're in, especially kind of in the current landscape of political uncertainty, economic uncertainty, environmental uncertainty, right? How can we still continue to work on our own well-being, right? What are the factors that are involved there? So that's kind of the you know, where my interests have started to shift towards.
Difficult question then. So you talked about, you know, is well-being something that is tangible? Is it something that we can impact? And then, you know, how do we actually go about doing that? I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you then, well, is well-being something tangible and how do you impact it?
I knew you were going to say that, so I'm just going to pause and have a drink while I think about the answer.
No, that's fine. Take your time.
No, I think one of the things when it comes to well-being that we really need to think about is that it's very much contextual. Right, so the idea is that it's this, or the World Health Organization defines it as this sort of state of, and I'm going to absolutely butcher this definition, the state of being where we can, you know, connect with our environments and we can achieve our goals and sort of fulfill our potential, essentially, right? There are lots of different contextual factors involved in how we might define well-being. So it might be very different for me than it is for somebody else, right? What well-being looks like for me might be very different. For me personally, well-being might be very different in the summer when I don't have loads of marking to do and loads of students emailing me all the time. Like, my well-being in that situation might look very different to what it does in the middle of a semester where I'm extremely busy and there's lots of pressure on and there's lots of things to do. Culturally, well-being might look very different. So we define well-being from a very individualistic perspective because we live in an individualistic society, right? Whereas more collectivist societies might define well-being in very different ways. It might be much more about connection and community and belonging. So, is it a tangible thing that we can get hold of and work towards? Yes, but it's also very personal and very much impacted on by lots of different factors. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm trying to sort of skirt around the edges of something that's really quite difficult to get hold of.
Absolutely. No, it does. It really does. It's actually, I'll be honest, I've not really heard or considered that before about the idea of your well-being actually being something quite personal to you. I think it is, because when you read something like the definition of well-being from the World Health Organization, it does feel very like concrete, like this is what well-being is. But actually what you're saying is, no, it's not like this concrete thing that we all should be working towards. It can fluctuate and change, and it's flexible and
absolutely
unique. Yeah, I think unique was the word.
Yeah. And I think like this is where we run into problems because, you know, the internet is full of people telling you what you need to do to look after your well-being. You need to do this, you need to do, well, like you can't really tell people what they have to do in order to look after their own well-being. It's like it's this process of discovery and kind of personal meaning. What does well-being mean to you personally? Okay, now we can probably help you kind of figure out how to get there, but what it actually is and what it looks like you said, you know, it's unique.
Totally, and it's given me a bit of a shot in the arm, to be honest, hearing you say that, because in the work that I do in coaching is I often emphasize the importance of, you know, in the early stages we're just trying to build that awareness, both sort of physically, mentally, emotionally, to help the individual understand, you know, what actually is it that I want to achieve in terms of my goals. So I could extend that, I suppose, to, well, what actually is well-being for me in this instance.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective, and it's given me a lot to think about already. So thanks for sharing that. We'll move on to consider some big misconceptions that men may hold, because in my situation, my background, I went through a period where I was really struggling with my mental health. Any kind of chat around mental health or well-being, this kind of conversation I would not have been interested in it at all. In fact, I would go as far as to say that I didn't even believe in mental health, if that makes sense. So when it came to something like therapy or getting support for my mental health, that would have just not been an option on the table at all. And I certainly had misunderstandings around what therapy or getting support for my mental health might look like. So from your experience, what are the biggest misconceptions people tend to have around therapy or mental health support?
I think there's still a lot of stigma around mental health, right? We're moving in the right direction, absolutely. But there is still a tremendous amount of stigma around mental health. And there's this idea that seeking help, talking about mental health issues, is a sign of weakness or some sort of like flaw, right? There's something wrong. And I think that's one of the sort of real key issues as to why people don't seek help, particularly young men, right? I think shame is a really powerful emotion. And I think if you think about kind of some of the real impactful moments, right? Things that really, really stick in your memory, right, from childhood or from whatever. And a lot of those moments, the really impactful moments, are associated with moments of shame, right, where you've been embarrassed about something or you've got into trouble for something. Right, so shame is this really, really powerful emotion. And I think that there's a lot of that tied up with this notion of seeking help for perhaps mental health issues, mental health difficulties, right? So if shame is this kind of really powerful thing, then it becomes this really powerful barrier as well that stops us from wanting to seek help, because it's another admission, or it's seen as another admission that perhaps there's some sort of weakness, some sort of admission of a flaw, something that maybe we've done wrong. So that's kind of a really kind of powerful barrier to seeking mental health support, I think.
Yeah, and I can see how that was definitely true in my own experience, in that I didn't want to be seen to be struggling as well. You know, if somebody was to know that, you know, I didn't have my shit together, basically, then yeah, I would feel a lot of shame and embarrassment around that. My follow-up question then is, what can we do in order to encourage men to actually reach out for support when they are in that period of, or in that place of finding things difficult?
It's a really interesting question, because like on the surface of it, it seems so simple, right? We hear this message over and over and over again, right? Reach out for help, speak to somebody, open up, right? And they are all really good messages, and they are all absolutely things that we should be doing. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think we have to acknowledge that it's complicated. There's lots of reasons why it might be a difficult thing to do. So I think starting to maybe talk about some of those reasons and unpack some of those reasons is a really useful starting point. So, okay, just open up, just speak to somebody, find somebody to talk to, great. However, for example, Black people are more likely than average to experience a common mental health problem in any given week, right? However, they're also 4 to 5 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act than white people, and they're more likely to be detained more than once. Black people are 4 times more likely to be subjected to restrictive interventions, right? So experiencing a mental health difficulty and then being restrained in hospital. People from minoritized ethnic backgrounds experience longer wait times, less likely to be referred for treatment after assessment, more likely to have worse outcomes after assessment. There's a historical distrust around the medical profession and around sort of psychology and psychiatry. So it's harder for some people to just open up and just talk to somebody than other people. You know, a couple of other examples, like asylum seekers, refugees, are at a higher risk of mental health issues for like loads of reasons. But there are reasons why they might not necessarily want to open up and seek help, because entering the system might cause a whole load of other problems, other difficulties. Therapy isn't cheap, right? There's long wait times on the NHS. So, you know, going private is costly. So that's another sort of, so, you know, we've got to look at the structural barriers and maybe start to remove some of them. And talk about some of them, which might make it easier for people to just open up, right? I think the Samaritans did a piece of research recently where they said the suicide rate for men, the suicide rate was 10 times higher in men from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, right? So there's a financial element to this. We've got to take into account all of these sorts of things. We've not even talked about like disability or neurodivergence, right? And some of those issues as well. So we can destigmatize mental health, and we can say open up and just talk about it. But we've got to start by acknowledging that it's actually harder for some people than it is for others to do that. While to actually answer your question, while we have acknowledged all of that stuff, you know, then we can start to peel apart some of these ideas around you know, the relationships that we have with emotions, right? And acknowledging that all emotions are just a part of this human experience. So we're kind of reducing some of that shame associated with opening up and talking about it, right? We're taught from a very early age that happiness is good and sadness is bad. So, you know, we shouldn't be sad, right? But if we can kind of acknowledge that all of these emotions are part of the human experience, right? They're just part of being an alive person. Kind of deprogramming, I guess, in a sort of way, then maybe it's a little bit easier. Then maybe it opens up those avenues for people to just talk about it, just open up, just say something, find somebody you can speak to. because it's this idea of a common humanity where actually most people are experiencing similar things, right? Similar experiences, similar emotions. But I do think it's really important to talk about some of those structural issues, structural barriers, perhaps as a starting point.
You've hit the nail on the head in a number of ways there. I used to be of the sort of naive. I had this naive understanding that talking was the answer. So I'm not, like you say, the messaging is great. There's nothing wrong with the messaging behind it and the intention behind it to encourage people to talk. But as you've quite rightly identified, there are so many other barriers that actually are preventing people from even getting to that point of considering opening up or chatting through it or getting extra support, or even being in a position to afford that support, or get that support, in a state of and if a crisis was to come up, and they need immediate intervention and they don't have the resources to access that. So yeah, that's a really, really good point. And the other one that I think, again, I often reflect on my own experience with this and what you're saying about understanding that emotions aren't sort of bad or good. It's kind of breaking this binary thinking of like, well, this emotion is bad and I shouldn't feel this, and this one is good and I should be working towards this, and understanding that actually this sort of taking a neutral approach and realizing, yeah, they're just part of that human emotion, that human experience is so important. But it's a difficult thing to do by yourself, from my own experience anyway. I don't know if that's is that something that you have experienced in work with people? Is that, it often takes having a therapist or a coach there to kind of help them through that process?
Yeah, I think so, and I think like things like this, so your podcast, for example, like are really nice ways of accessibly having those conversations, right? And like giving people things to consider that they might not necessarily have considered looking at it that way. So like therapy is great, everybody should have therapy. And opening up and talking about this stuff is great, absolutely. But I think, yeah, because it's something that's instilled in us, and I use the word programmed because that's essentially what it is. We're programmed from a very, very early age. That these are the good emotions and we should have more of them, and these are the bad emotions. So yeah, it probably does take a little bit of deprogramming, whether that is, like I say, through a therapist or through a psychologist, or whether it is just things like this, things like these conversations, being more open, and hearing men talk about things in this way is a way of opening up some of that stuff and opening those thoughts around. Okay, well, actually, maybe it is okay to experience anxiety or fear or sadness or upset or anger and frustration. Like, it's okay to experience those things as well. So I think, yeah, therapy is great. Everybody should have therapy. But also there are other ways that we can start to have these conversations and start to sort of, deprogram ourselves from these ideas that we have around emotion. Because it's a fairly kind of Western look at it as well, right? This isn't a universal thing. This is kind of our culture and our society and the way that we, and particularly British people, right? Sort of like stiff upper lip, don't show any emotion. So yeah, I think if it can be programmed into us, it can be deprogrammed as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I do want to pick up on what you said there about like everyone needs therapy, because I like I say, I always go back to my old self or my younger self and think, how would he have reacted to that? And I would have been like, I don't need therapy. Why would you say everyone needs therapy? There's people around me that seem to have their life together. I'm the one that's struggling. Maybe I need some, but other people around me, they're all fine. They're all coping. So I totally agree with that statement. Absolutely. And I know you've touched on a number of things as well. Obviously mentioned deprogramming and the idea of deprogramming. But why would you say everybody needs therapy, and what would be the purpose of it?
Well, I mean, first of all, like my 20-year-old self would have probably said exactly the same as you, right? But I think we tend to not process all of the stuff that happens to us. Okay, and again, part of it is because we live in a very individualistic culture, in a very individualistic society. So we don't necessarily have those structures around us, right? Those kind of extended family structures, that extended community that maybe we used to have, where we kind of talk and process and share experiences, right? You mentioned the stuff that you do with some of the people that you work with around self-awareness. And self-awareness, for me anyway, is a foundational psychological skill. And it is the basis for anything else that you want to do, right? So self-awareness is such an important part of self-development, self-improvement, whatever you might want to call it. And, just having somebody who will facilitate that process, right? Who will ask the right questions, who will dig in the right areas and help you kind of pull stuff out of yourself, it's such an important building block for anything else that you might want to do. So I think, there's this sort of misconception that therapy or seeing a psychologist or a counselor or whatever is something that you do when something is wrong. Whereas actually, it's a foundation, it's a building block, right? So having that therapeutic relationship where somebody will, like I say, ask the right questions, be a mirror to reflect, so you can become more self-aware, I think is an important thing for anybody to do.
Yeah, I totally, again, agree with that. And it was a big misconception. There were many misconceptions, as I'm sure you're aware of in terms of what I'm saying here. But I think because I went through therapy and I think in the early stages, I was really struggling, and it felt right in quotation marks, if that makes sense. I recognise I need help here, but then it got to a point where things were much better. And I realised, well, actually, no, I can continue on with this. I could probably carry on without therapy, but there's lots more for me to explore and to improve on. And I want to improve and get better. And just feel more balanced and more self-aware. And there's that coming to that, having that experience helped me realise exactly what you're saying. That therapy isn't just for a crisis situation. It can be something that you can use when things are going well in life as well. It doesn't have to be isolated to those challenging periods.
Yeah, I think sometimes it takes like a precipitating event, or something to happen to sort of push, maybe give somebody that initial push. But yeah, like you say, I think once you realise that, this is actually beneficial. I'm actually, this is good.
I don't know why it's such a shock, but yeah.
Who knew? Talking about stuff is good. Who knew? But yeah, so I think sometimes, yes, there's an initial push, right? And that's absolutely fine. But I think I would encourage people to explore, have a go. You might not like it, whatever, right? But you might, and you might find out something really interesting about yourself.
Something that also has been my experience is not just to necessarily, if you have a poor experience initially or it doesn't quite fit, not just to be like, no, that's it, because just like the way I've analogized it before is like with personal trainers, you have different methodologies or different approaches and communication styles and all sorts. So it's not like if you had one bad experience with a personal trainer, then all of them are rendered useless or what have you. It's important to maybe try a few and figure out what kind of therapeutic relationship works best for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I appreciate your thoughts on it. It's been really interesting so far. I'm going to move on just to speak more specifically around masculinity, because I've seen a lot of your content online and this pops up quite often. And it's obviously a conversation I'm quite interested in myself as well. So, difficult question. I'm firing lots of difficult questions your way this morning, so apologies for that. But which ideas around masculinity do you believe negatively impact men's mental health today, and how might we start changing that? Maybe you've answered some of that already, but any thoughts? Probably touched on a couple of things, so some of those ideas around shame being a really powerful emotion. But I think, there's probably obvious stuff, all right? Probably stuff that you've heard like hundreds of times before. I've talked already about these ideas that are programmed into us that, we should be strong,
and tough, and shouldn't cry, and like from a really, really early age, right? Like, what are you crying for? You've got nothing to cry about. Toughen up. Boys don't cry. All that sort of stuff, right? These are like clear messages that we can't deny that they're there, right? Because they're obvious and we can see them all over the place, right? I think so. There's from that becomes this idea that we should have like control, right? That men should be in control of their emotions and be able to repress what are essentially just really healthy expressions of emotion, right? But we should be able to sort of control and repress some of those things. I think one of the again, one of the kind of like more obvious things that's there that again perpetuates these messages are go to any supermarket. Right, go to any supermarket, go and look in the clothes aisles for children. And you can probably see probably know what's coming, but we still have supermarkets with boys' clothes and girls' clothes, right? And boys' clothes have like dinosaurs and guns and shit, right? And girls' clothes have like unicorns and rainbows. But it's more than just that, right? So you look at things like shower gel, right? Nivea for men. This podcast is not sponsored by Nivea, right? But you have exactly the same product in like a little, a bottle with like a nice flower on it or whatever. So like all of these messages are just like continuously reinforced. Okay, so that's one thing. But how do those ideas around masculinity impact on mental health? We're teaching kids and we're teaching ourselves about expectations of how to perform gender roles, right? Boys should be tough. Boys shouldn't cry. Boys should be interested in guns and violence, right? And fighting. Girls should be interested in smiling and rainbows and unicorns. So we're teaching people those messages. I saw something really interesting just yesterday, actually. And it was somebody on TikTok, and they were saying for World Book Day, right? Would you have a problem sending your daughter to school dressed up as a male character from literature, right? Probably not. We wouldn't have a problem with that. What if it was the other way around? Would you have a problem sending your son to school dressed as a female character, right? And like, I had a reaction to that. Like, I know that it's silly, and it absolutely, in principle, it would be absolutely fine, or it should be absolutely fine. But even I, who am sort of aware that it's ridiculous, I still had a reaction to it. A reaction of, oh, well, that would be, I don't know what that would be, all right? So we're kind of reinforcing these ideas that I guess, boys shouldn't have role models that are women, and aspiring to be like somebody who is a woman, aspiring to have a woman as a role model is somehow a weakening of your own masculinity. I just thought it was a really interesting question to ask that sort of sparked up a lot of sort of ideas. So again, it's kind of going back to your original question, ideas around masculinity that impact on mental health. Well, it's all of this stuff, right? It's all of this stuff tied together, these kind of expectations that we have around how we should express our gender. And that sort of very narrow view, I guess, leads to some of that sort of emotional repression that we talked about a little bit earlier on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, absolutely. And that it's funny when you explained the video you saw on TikTok. I had a similar reaction. I was a bit like, oh yeah,
yeah, right. I was like, what's that about?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, that's a bit. Yeah, I would feel a bit. I would feel uncomfortable with that potentially initially, but then, as you say, you question it, and you're like, well, why? Yeah, what? Where's that come from? And yeah, exactly, it's really interesting, and it's obviously like I think personally when you've touched on shame a lot, and I think something that I've had to I've come to understand is that a lot of these beliefs are ones that I've inherited. They've been passed on to me, and that's not to say it's not my responsibility to challenge those beliefs and question them, but it is to say, like, I can take that sort of compassionate point of view to be like, look, it's not necessarily your fault that you maybe believe and perpetuate some of these ideas, but it is your responsibility to challenge them and do something about it.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I think exploring like I say, I had that sort of reaction of, oh, what is that? Like, why did I have that feeling of, oh, that would be a bit different. But I think, it's really easy to look at people like Andrew Tate and, these other sort of like people who are talking about, masculinity has to be this and that. And it's easy to kind of look at them and blame them and say, like, they're bad and they're sort of influencing, young boys in our society. But I don't think that's fair, because I think they are a symptom rather than a cause of a society that is inherently misogynist, right? It is, for all of the reasons that I've just talked about, right? Shower gel bottles, kids' clothing, right? Role models. So our society is inherently misogynist, and it allows people like that to play on that, rather than them being a cause of it. We talk about things like caring professions. Caring professions are still dominated by women. So it's, when we talk about ideas around masculinity and having an impact on mental health, again, it's kind of easy to blame the individual, the individual person, and say, well, you have these ideas, therefore your mental health is impacted. But again, we look at some of the more structural stuff. I think about I've completely lost my thread. I think about like caring professions being dominated by women. So if I walk into that sort of caring space, right, as a man who's seeking help, and I see that all of the psychologists and therapists, or like 90% of them, are women, well, I'm thinking, well, that's not really a space for me to be in, right? So again, structural things that are kind of perhaps important here.
It does make it difficult. It throws up more barriers, I guess, in some ways. Not to sort of make it a competition about who's got more obstacles in terms of getting help with their mental health or what have you. But it does throw up specific barriers for men, definitely, and hopefully in time the societal structures will begin to change. And I think we are seeing some movement. It might be slow, but we are seeing some progress in some ways.
Yeah, and I think, it's like you say, we're kind of highlighting all of these barriers and all these difficulties, but I think just talking about them is important, and removing them as well, and kind of acknowledging that they exist. And it's not even just like the fringe stuff, right? The sort of Andrew Tates or whatever. Like, I remember last year, Piers Morgan was having like a bit of a meltdown because there was a picture of like a man carrying a baby in like one of those baby carriers, saying that it was emasculating. So again, we've just got these ideas around like caring for your children is somehow not a masculine thing. So, yes, it's a barrier, but it's also an avenue to have conversations and to talk about this stuff openly, and to kind of remove some of these misconceptions around, what masculinity is or isn't. So I think, it's easy to kind of highlight the problems and the barriers, but we have to use them as opportunities to open up these conversations to remove some of them as well.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it, rather than seeing it as a problem. Rather, it's an opportunity to do something about it. Yeah, that's really good. Great. Well, thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. It's been really interesting to hear a little bit of your own experience so far. We're going to move on now, because you mentioned already that you've done some, a lot of your research was on sort of stress, and potentially from the sort of sports psychology point of view. But I know that you've done, and you create content around sort of stress and burnout and that sort of thing. So I wanted to hone in on that topic, because I think it's quite relevant. Specifically for men. Why do you think that a lot of men tend to ignore stress until they're completely burnt out? I've got a follow-up question, but I'll stop there for now. One at a time. My brain can't cope with more than one thing. So I mean, if you think about what burnout is, first of all, I think it's sometimes helpful to talk about that. So burnout is this sort of syndrome, it's ongoing syndrome of 3 different characteristics. So the first one is like emotional and physical exhaustion. Second one is a sense of reduced personal accomplishment. So this is feeling like
no matter how much effort you're putting into something, you're just not really getting anywhere. And then the third one is this idea of depersonalization, right? And this is just like a cynicism or a cynical attitude towards the work that you're doing or the relationships at work or whatever it might be, right? The cynicism. And burnout is, first of all, it's a response to chronic stress, right? But there's also something in there around the way that we are committed to the thing that we are doing. So this researcher a few years back, Tom Radicke, talked about commitment in terms of attraction to a role, to a job, to a situation versus entrapment. So what we see in the sports literature is that people who are attracted, they're committed to a role, being an athlete or a coach or whatever it is, because they're attracted to it, like they want to do it. They want to be there. There are lots of benefits to what they're doing. The costs are relatively low. There's just like a sense of enjoyment, right? Versus people who are entrapped in what they're doing, where the benefits aren't quite as high as maybe they used to be. The value isn't really there. The costs, emotionally, financially, whatever, are starting to creep up a little bit. There's a lack of potential alternatives. So our identity becomes a little bit sort of tied in with the thing that we're doing. So like the idea that, well, I am an athlete, I'm only an athlete, there's kind of nothing else to me. So when we're sort of in that kind of situation, like that's when we're more likely to experience burnout as a result of stress, when we feel like we have to do the thing that we're doing rather than feeling like we want to do it, right? So why is this important in terms of sort of masculinity? Well, we live in a culture that celebrates overwork. Right, our culture celebrates overwork, and this is kind of ideas around neoliberalism, right? It's all about productivity and work and overwork, and we celebrate burnout, and we celebrate all these ideas around being strong and pushing through and being tough and being resilient and being gritty. Like all of these are kind of really important buzzwords. And again, that's magnified in elite sport, sort of hyper masculine type environment. And what we found in the literature, in the coaching literature, we call this this situation that people get in, we call it the superhero complex. And this is where people feel like they need to push through and be all things to all people and not show any sign of weakness. And they're in this situation where they don't necessarily want to do the thing that they're doing anymore, but they feel trapped in it. There's nothing else that they can do. So this superhero complex, right, tied with this sort of high performance, high pressure type environment, ultimately leads to burning out. And I think a lot of those ideas that we've talked about already on this podcast around like strength and resilience and grit and toughness, these sort of typically what you might consider to be masculine ideas, just kind of really tie everything together into this big superhero ball. So I think that's why lots of men perhaps don't seek help until, well, or even during burnout, even after it's too late. Because of these ideas around the superhero.
Yeah, and I think the way you've described it about how these ideas of strength and resilience, it all ties it all together and almost traps men in that place. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense and something that I've witnessed and seen myself over the years. So, yeah, the follow-up question, well, and I know we're maybe covering the same ground, so I might change this question a little bit, but the question was going to be, how can we sort of prevent reaching this point? But perhaps I'm going to change it a little bit and ask, for people who have actually reached that point of burnout, how do you then get out of that?
So the simple answer, which isn't really simple, is to rest and to take a break, and step away from whatever it is that you are doing. That's not realistic though, because if you're, you got to pay a mortgage, right? You got to look after your kids. You have responsibilities. So it would be lovely to just be able to take a 2-week break whenever I want to, or to take 6 months off work when I'm feeling stressed, right? It'd be great to be able to do that. And that's a really good way to recover from burnout, that rest and recovery, but I can't always do that. So there's a couple of things that I would start with, and I'll try to keep it brief because I could talk about this for hours. So the first one is trying to take those ideas of rest and recovery and build them in on a daily basis, rather than, okay, I'm exhausted, I'm going to take 2 weeks off. It's like, okay, how can I build in rest and recovery in my daily life, right? If you were an athlete, you would not be in the gym for 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. You couldn't do it. So you have to build in rest and recovery as part of performance, right? It's not like an additional luxury, like, oh, I've got a bit of time, I'm going to rest now. It's a part of your performance strategy to build in rest and recovery to allow you to carry. So how can we start to build in those periods of recovery and recuperation and rest into our daily basis, right? And it can be really small things. So how often, for example, do you, during your day, take a full, deep breath? You probably don't, right? You probably don't. It takes 10 seconds. Right? Do that once every hour. All right. Just take a lap of the office, stand up, move, stretch, do something. Take like a 2-minute break. Set the Outlook calendar invite to default to 55 minutes instead of an hour, to make sure that you got 5 minutes in between things, right? Use those really small moments of recovery because they build up, they accumulate, right? The second thing that I would say is around identity. All right, so I talked about this idea that, you're an athlete, it's all that you do. So if that starts to not go very well, because there's going to be times where it's not going well, because that's just life, and that is all you've got, then your entire self-identity will crumble, right? If, however, I'm an athlete, but I'm also somebody's son or daughter, I'm also somebody's partner, I'm somebody who likes music, I'm somebody who likes art, I'm somebody who likes, going out for walks, whatever it might. So are you taking care of those other parts of your identity as well? So that when sport isn't going so well, or use sport as an example, but whatever it is, like when your job isn't going so well, actually I've still got other bits of my identity that are important to me and that I'm working on. So recovering from burnout, a couple of things. Building in rest and recuperation daily, weekly, monthly, rather than leaving it and trying to take it all at once. And thinking about what other elements of your identity you have and doing things that move you towards, what's important to you in those areas.
Absolutely. I think this is a common sort of idea that men have, is that I need to constantly be pushing and grinding and doing, and if I'm resting and recovering, I'm sort of wasting time almost, even to the point when when you are at max capacity. There's, again, it probably comes back to the societal structures and the messaging and the programming that encourages us almost to keep doing that, to keep pushing beyond our limits, and there's something sort of noble about that as well. I find it difficult. I will admit that I find that difficult. It's something that I discovered recently in therapy. That I find it really difficult to rest and to switch off. And I always thought that I was good at relaxing, but I'm not. Because there's constantly that sort of like, okay, well, you should be doing this, or you could be doing that, or why aren't you doing this bit of work that you've got to do, or maybe you should be doing that. So, again, that sort of discovery, that self-awareness, that learning, there absolutely is that sort of push to do things. And I just wanted to say, it's not easy. I struggle with it as well. But it's sort of being aware of that and then trying to sort of, right, I'm going to switch off. Okay, how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to leave my phone on the other side of the room. All right, I'm not going to take my laptop with me when I go to this place or whatever it is. So it's like, once you sort of have that self-awareness and understanding, that's when you can start to put in some of those strategies that will help. I look at what you've said in terms of the small sort of bite-sized chunks, instead of trying to overhaul everything and take, that's a sort of philosophy I use in my own coaching, because it's so often people come into the coaching space with these ideas or grand ideas of I'm absolutely going to rip apart my lifestyle. I'm going to make all these changes in terms of my nutrition and my exercise. And, inevitably, if they do go ahead and do that, it only lasts a week, if that, and then they feel worse again, because it's like this never-ending cycle of like, oh, I'm trying to make all these huge changes, they fail, I feel terrible, and then I go down this route that I don't want to go down. But yeah, I try and emphasize, look, let's think about implement these really small changes over time, and we can gradually add things as well, and that's going to lead to a more sustainable change. So yeah, absolutely, I think that's an important message, is to try and implement these small changes rather than trying to rip everything apart and bring in something brand new. I also really like what you said about identity, because similarly, you're saying that for you, that the rest and recovery is something that you can identify that is challenging for you. I similarly, for me, it's the identity side, because I can, as a business owner, I can find myself getting very wrapped up in my identity, gets wrapped up in my business. If things are going well with my business, then I feel great. Whereas sometimes if it's not going so well, I can feel that having an impact on me and my identity, my worth and esteem and all that sort of stuff. So trying to find my identity in things that aren't just work is very, very important to me.
Yeah, I think it's one of the easiest ways to think about what's important to you, because people find it difficult to do. It's easy to say, you should think about what you value and do some of that. Easy on paper, difficult in practice, right? But one of the easiest things that people can do, and it's a little bit morbid, right? But imagine you're on a funeral. What do you want people to say about you, right? Do you want people to say, oh yeah, Chris was great. He spent, 70 hours a week working on his business. He was brilliant at that. All right. Oh yeah, it was brilliant. Do you remember all that? Remember all those times when he never came home because he was just so busy working, right? You don't want people to say those things, right? You, or maybe you do, all right, and that's also fine. But by and large, you probably want people to talk about, I want people to talk about the fact that I was kind, and that I was considerate, and that I was a good father, I hope, right, and a good husband. So they're the kinds of things that I want people to say. So in terms of figuring out what's important to me and where I should be putting my attention, what do I want people to say about me when I'm dead, right? Well, they're the things that I want to work on. They're the things that I want to put my attention into. The other parts of my identity are father, husband, somebody who's kind, somebody who's considerate, somebody who's helpful, right? They're things, somebody who has fun, right? And enjoys life, right? They're the things that are important to me. So that's the other elements of my identity that are important to work on.
Definitely going to go away and do that for myself and write out what I want people to say at my funeral. Hopefully my funeral's a long time from now. Yeah. Anyway, thanks for sharing all that. It's super helpful. I'm sure the listeners have a lot to go away and think on, or maybe they might end up writing their own funeral. I've forgotten the word for it. Obituary. Eulogy. Yeah. There you Obituary. Go. That's it. Thanks. Yeah, we'll move on because I realise time's pretty much gone. But before we finish up, I always have two questions that I finish with, and they're not easy questions. But we'll go for it anyway. I mean, you're used to that now. So, what advice?
I'm warmed up now.
The first question is: what advice would you give to men who are finding themselves in a tough place right now?
I think we kind of covered this earlier. It's about talking to somebody. And we talked about all those barriers around therapy and accessing therapy, right? And there's a sort of cultural factors, structural factors, whatever. But I think, it doesn't have to be, it can be anybody, right? And it's just about sort of being a little bit brave, being a little bit bold. And when somebody says, how are you doing? Noticing that automatic drive to say, I'm fine, right? And just noticing that as a starting point, right? Am I fine? Why am I saying that? And finding somebody, whether it's a friend, whether it's a colleague that you trust, whether it's a family member, it doesn't really matter. But I think once you sort of dare to be brave and actually say, do you know what, I'm not fine, or I'm tired. You don't have to sort of start with, I'm deep in the throes of depression. you can just say, actually, do you know what? I'm quite tired this week. Or actually, do you know what? Like, I'm feeling a bit sad because this thing happened. All right. So it doesn't, you don't have to start with like sort of, major mental health difficulties, but just being a little bit honest and like notice what reaction you might get from that. And there's all sorts of different ways. There's like online mental health, like forums, right? You can kind of talk about this stuff anonymously. There's all sorts of different ways that you can access it. But the first step is just to like be a little bit brave, a little bit bold. And again, that acknowledgement that, right, this is part of the experience of being human. This isn't a bad thing. It's not a good thing either. It's just a thing that's happening that I'm experiencing. And I guess trying to decouple that experience from some of that, shame and stigma that we talked about earlier. Sorry, there was a lot in there for what was ostensibly like quite a short answer question.
No, that was really helpful. No, it was really good, and it is. Yeah, you've highlighted something that I'm very aware I do as well. If someone says, "How are you?" Your bog standard answer is, "Yeah, I'm fine," or "Yeah, well, I'm all right." Even if that's not necessarily the case. Yeah, not bad. You. Not bad. You. That's it. And I think from what you said, it's also a very good way of gauging, because I know from my own experience, there's some people that I've learned I can potentially be a little more open with than others, just in terms of maybe their own awareness and understanding and knowing how to maybe communicate. But that might be a good way of kind of understanding, okay, is this person maybe someone that I could maybe have a sort of deeper conversation with? Because if you say, like, as you've given an example, like, oh yeah, I'm really tired this week, or I'm feeling really sad because this happened, and as you say, notice a response. If they're quite open and maybe ask a few more questions and dig a little bit deeper, then okay, this person is maybe someone I can come to with more serious challenges. Whereas if the response is maybe a little more like, oh, I'm sorry, or whatever, shuts you down and not really that interested, maybe that's an indicator like, okay, I need to maybe not be discouraged by that, but maybe look for another opportunity with somebody else.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Thanks very much. Last question then, and I'll let you get on with the rest of your bank holiday. So what one word would you use to describe a strong man, and why?
Oh, God. Oh man, this is I don't want to derail this entire thing, right? But I'm gonna.
That's fine. The podcast, you're going to end the podcast full stop. Single-handedly.
No, because in all seriousness though, right? I think this is where we might run into some difficulty and maybe fall into the trap of some of the things that we've talked about. Okay, I wonder whether we need to frame this in terms of strength. Okay, and I appreciate that your podcast is called the Strong Man Podcast, right? But I just is strength something that we so desperately need to be part of our identity, or like a masculine identity, that we are trying to like take other qualities and characteristics and define them in terms of like strength. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, like, this is definitely not a one-word answer. If like anything that I could say in terms of a one-word answer, right, you could equally apply to anybody regardless of how they choose to express their gender, right? So if I said like resilience, okay, well, that's not an exclusively masculine quality, right? Can we start to have these conversations like with those sorts of frames in mind, where actually the concept of like masculine characteristics and masculine like qualities like don't really exist?
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of the problem as well is that or one of the arguments of the sort of manosphere online is that they would take the sorts of things that I'm saying now and they'd say, well, like people, Pete doesn't want you to be a real man. He's sort of like telling you that you can't be masculine, that masculinity is a bad thing. And it's not that. It's not taking anything away from, men and masculinity. Like, I think it's the opposite of that. I think it's really liberating to allow men to explore all of these other characteristics, right? So masculinity doesn't have to be about something that we, have to then define as being strong. Okay, so like being caring, that's a sign of strength. It doesn't have to be. Maybe it can just be a sign of being caring, all right? Being vulnerable. Well, being vulnerable, that's a real strength. Why does it have to be strong, right? Why can't being vulnerable just be being vulnerable? Okay, like confidence, self-awareness, all of these like characteristics. So are we, like being compassionate, right? Are we perhaps like missing something and just, I don't want to say exacerbating the problem, but trying to define all of these things as strength is just kind of reinforcing the idea that, well, I need strength to be a part of my identity as a man. Well, do I? All right, why can't I just be caring and compassionate for the sake of being caring and compassionate, rather than after saying, well, that is strength, so I'm still strong, right? Because that's what men should be. It's just I'm defining it in a different way. Like, we don't need to define it in a different way. We can just be caring and compassionate and vulnerable and protective and confident and all of those different things just for the sake of those things. And like I say, I don't think that's taking things away from what we might traditionally look at as masculinity. I think it's adding to it. And I think that's just a liberating, wonderful thing to be able to do. And I think in terms of perhaps reducing mental health difficulties associated with this need to be a particular thing and fit in a particular box, like that's a way to do it.
Yeah. So I'll change the name then to the Man Podcast. No,
so I was so hyper aware when I was answering that question. I see the entire thing.
No, honestly, I really, really appreciate that response, and it's given me a lot of food for thought, because yeah, you're quite right. Like we need to get rid of boxes, and perhaps, as you quite rightly highlighted, by asking that question, it's firmly putting characteristics into certain boxes. Like this is what strength looks like, when actually we need to maybe question the box itself, or the wider idea of strength and emotions. And I do really appreciate that response, because it would be very easy to just go along with it, but I want to hear your honest thoughts on it. So thanks for sharing it.
No, thank you.
Thanks for joining the podcast today. It's been so good to chat to you and chat through everything we've spoken about. Before you head off, do you want to just take a second to share where people might be able to find you on social media and things like that, if they want to get in touch?
Sure, yeah. So where's the easiest place to look? I'm on Instagram at Dr_Pete _Olusoga, I think. I'm not sure, probably something like that. You just Google my name, it's easy enough. And if people want to hear more, I'm just going to shamelessly plug my own podcast here. So my podcast is the 80% Mental podcast, all words. So you head to 80percentmental.com. It's all around sort of performance and sport psychology, but also kind of talking about well-being and sort of health as well, and the psychology underpinning those things. So yeah, head to 80percentmental.com and you'll be able to find links to all of my other stuff as well, and through there. It's probably easiest.
Super. Pete, thanks so much for this conversation. It's been really good, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation.